And one thing I say about purpose is that it's not for anybody else's approval. And that's the big thing, is that so many people I know are living somebody else's purpose. You're somehow living a life that is not aligned with what you really want. I hear this all the time. I'm bored at my job. I feel numb. I'm not growing. And there's a concept of role remake. So like if you are working for someone and you want to continue working for them, is there any aspect of your job that can be changed or modified to bring you greater joy? One big part of purpose, I think, if you really want, if you ask me, and this may sound, biased, because there are people who are like, I love what I do and I don't necessarily give to anyone. At some point, that life is going to be empty. And I think that when we stop growing is when life is over.
Dr. Sue Varma, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh my God, Scott, I feel so humbled and honored. So thank you so much for such a lovely, warm introduction and for this mission and like for what you represent. And I just love what life and this high performance life means. And, that's very much what this book is about, practical optimism. Like the subtitle is The Art, Science, and Practice of Exceptional Well-Being, right? So when I first got into psychiatry or wanted to be a doctor, I was like, oh, I want to help people that are sick, right? And I realized that we were only taking people half the way. So when somebody came in and they were depressed, I realized, wow, like all that we're expected is to make them undepressed or like back to their baseline. But what if this baseline is what got them in the depression to begin with, right? And so looking at a person's like life in a 360 holistic approach, even though they're saying I'm depressed, and yes, a lot of times with this new understanding that depression is biological. It has to do with inflammation, our diet. Like, sure, there's things that happened to us in the past. There's significant stresses in our life, but that imbalance that you talk about of work and family and faith and spirituality and energy, whether it's exercise or being inspired and creative and following that creativity and seeing it through. So there's so many things that we can do that will take us not only back to a baseline, but beyond that. And that's really what I'm focusing sort of the next, next several decades of my life is exceptional well-being, because that's what excites me and inspires me. I know that there's a lot of doctors who, whatever their specialty, you break an arm, you go into the ER, they're like, okay, let's fix it, let's repair it. But it's like nobody's thinking about, okay, your forehand or your backhand at tennis. They're like, no, that's what you have trainers for. And I want to be that, quote, trainer to take you mentally and, sort of in every aspect of your life. So people get more than they bargain for. But there's only so many people I can work with at a time. I wanted this and it is going global. It's already being translated in several, 7 or 8 languages. It hasn't even come out in English yet. So that's really exciting. It's coming out on February 20th, 2024. And it's beyond anything that it's beyond me. It's like, I think of my work as a mission. It's not a career. And I feel grateful. I feel inspired. Took several years to write this book. It's based on, 20 plus years of the best science, clinical work practices. And I'm just so excited about all of this.
Isn't it fun to be a couple decades into a career? So we're similar age demographic, and I've been doing what I do for a couple decades. And you get to a point, I imagine, where you start to see a clarity that you didn't see when you were young. And it goes from a clarity that you didn't see when you were young to executing upon that clarity, to then taking it to a point where you're like, I have to share this. This is too great to share. And what I hear in your voice is your excitement to share over the next 2 decades or more and into the future, because you're making a bigger impact in the world.
Absolutely. Yes. And, I always knew like this sort of parallel career that I have of being a medical contributor and talking on, television or keynote speaker is I want to give people tools, and not everybody will see a therapist, whether it's because of cost, because of availability, because of any number of barriers, stigma associated. Oh, that's only for crazy people, whatever it might be. I think like younger generations are embracing therapy as just a part of what they do, part of self-care. But I think our age and above, people were like, no, I don't need to see, I'm fine. And that's reserved for only people who are very sick. So I want to make this accessible, available, fun, interesting, non-intimidating, non-threatening. And, what helped was interesting is years of doing TV when they're like, you have 5 minutes at best to give the best practices, give us the science, give us the epidemiology. Why did this happen? How did we get here? How are we going to get out of here? And it was like a joke in the beginning to me. I was like, you want me to distill all of this science that I studied for hundreds, thousands of hours into literally 30-second sound bites? But having that mentality of like, how do you communicate information? So even just the way you said to me, like, I'm going to keep this high energy, how you communicate. So you could be so knowledgeable, but if you can't break it down and make it fun and interesting and accessible, people are going to look at this as like, wait, this is one more homework. I don't want to do this. So I want to make it light and fun and an easy read. And, the feedback I'm getting is so far, that it is that way. So I feel humbled and happy that like, this is turning out the way that I was hoping it would.
Did you visualize this when you were new and young in your career and starting out? Did you always have the vision that you wanted to take your career to a level that was not only helping the one person in front of you every day, but an amplified effect and impact?
I didn't know. To be honest with you, I was a very shy kid. And there was this one book that changed my life, I have to say. And it sounds so funny, like how one book can change your life. And it was a self-help book. And that's what got me excited and interested in writing one. So as a kid, I had friends, but like they were a good group of people that knew me and that I could let my guard down with. But my parents, who are in the medical mental health profession, would take me to these conferences or parties, and they were like leaders in the community. And I was like 12, 13, and I would be like, I don't know anybody here. Why are you dragging me to this stuff? Like, I don't want to be here. And my dad would try to broker friendships. He'd find the one girl he thinks was my age and be like, hey, meet my daughter. Do you want to be friends? And I remember like one day getting so mortified. I was like, why does my dad have to introduce me to complete strangers? Like, I should be able to go up to people. Like, that became a goal of mine, to go up to someone that I don't know and say, hi, I'm Sue. What's your name? Like, where are you from? And get to know them. Because I was curious. I was curious. And if you got to know me, I would be open. But that was like a specific goal. And literally, I remember being at the mall with my friends, and we went shopping, the typical teenage thing. And then I went into the Barnes and Nobles and the self-help section. And I was like, oh, what's here? And there was a book called Conquering Shyness. And I don't even know, I still have the book in my parents' house. I don't even know what was in there, but I was just like, I'm going to do it. And I made a decision. And I think from that point on, because I was like, I have stuff I want to say. I have stuff I want to learn from other people. And I have what felt like a handicap at that point. I didn't have social anxiety, nothing like diagnosable, but I was like, I have to get over this, and once I got over it, I felt like I could talk to people. And then I started public speaking, like kind of at a young age. First, smaller audiences, and it got bigger and bigger. So I feel like sometimes we may be meant to do something, but we have either self-imposed limitations, fears, like you get in your own head. So, that would be my 2 cents, is like, I think everybody has, whenever I talk to my patients, I was like, what do you want to do? What inspires you? What gets you excited? What are you good at? And they're like, I don't know what I'm good at. I'm not good at anything. And I'm like, I don't buy that. So think about those invisible limitations that you self-impose. So I never thought, to answer your question, that I'd be talking to these many people because of that limitation that I had put on myself.
What a blessing it is that your parents and my parents did this as well. And looking back, it's really valuable. I was in so many adult conversations. I was in so many settings that were above the level of where I was as a child. And it seems like, as simple as that sounded, and even stretching the comfort zone, your father was making you uncomfortable, but doing so
Yes.
with a level of love and excitement. And, as parents, we're so imperfect. We do the best that we can, and we think that we're doing the best thing for our children. It's not always the perfect thing, but looking back, it helped drive you to make a decision to deal with the challenge.
Totally, totally. And it's so interesting that you say that are being in adult conversations, and also just absorbing. Like, I would go to meetings with him. And I think one of the things that really influenced me to become a psychiatrist is my dad is a psychiatrist. And, I had really no idea what that entailed, because there's so much confidentiality around the doctor's office. So it's not like you can just go in to like a cardiologist's office or internal medicine and play with the stethoscope and play with instruments. Like, there was nothing to play with. He had like a pad and a paper. And I was like, what do you do exactly? And I remember people coming up to us at a grocery store and, different times in our town. And they would say to me, And I was really young. They were like, your dad changed my life. And I was like, that's interesting. I don't know exactly how and what. And then I found out that they had a history of like, substance abuse, and that was one of his specialties. And they were like, yeah, like I was drinking, I was using drugs, and there was no hope for me. And he really helped me turn it around. And then I learned about the 12 step and, just like the importance of faith and spirituality. I started going to meetings sometimes, like you can just sit in. And I was like, wow, these are some of the coolest, most fun people I've ever met, smart, sense of humor. And they talked about the power in these rooms. And, I know some people are like not for it, but the point is, I was like, I want to be my dad's Dr. Varma. I didn't change my name after I got married because I was like, I just want to be him. And my whole life, I just wanted to be, who is this person that has changed? And then over time, I started to learn what happens in those rooms. And I was like, wow, this is like powerful, to change the trajectory of somebody's life.
I'm a firm believer that, strong women there's no secret recipe, but a strong father figure and a father-daughter relationship is something so special. My wife and her father are super close. And I'm so grateful as, a person that's been married to her for 20 plus years. And you see that as you get older, that relationship, that admiration, that love has driven us to have better relationships. And it's allowed for, um, I call it like almost like a gap of understanding. Like when you have a father you're close to, some of the things that are challenging that we might see the world differently or come at things differently, they might have seen their dad do these things, and there's just a result that's positive. So it's so nice to hear the relationship that you have with your father and that he really is someone you wanted to emulate.
Yes. And I love what you said, like in terms of the father-daughter relationship, because I think that it gives you, that, they always say like that's the model of how you want to be treated, And I remember, Scott, one time in my life, when I was young and single, I remember somebody saying to me, a guy like, I can't mess with you. You must have had a good relationship with your dad, like I can't get away with giving you breadcrumbs because you expect more. Like you have good self-esteem. And I thought, how interesting of an observation to make, that like you have a strong foundation. And that's what I think it's so beautiful. Like and I was close with both of my parents. My mom, is no longer, but both of them put the foundation of you can do whatever you want, and and they challenged me along the way. They didn't, they were very strict as parents, conservative, traditional, South Asian family, immigrated here in the 60s and 70s and had this idealized version of what India was. And it changed and it evolved, and they were still stuck in this sort of, it's such a, perfect. And they were also very idealistic in their ways of thinking, which I love because they taught me so much about honor and integrity and community service and these core values that drive me, that I wouldn't be the person or doing the things that I do if I didn't have that. And it also helped me let go of a lot of things. So I feel like I'm very driven by the work that I do, and any of the accolades or any of the fun, cool, glamorous stuff, it's all just icing on the cake. It's not why I do it. And so when people, like now with social media, and it's such a weird world because I didn't grow up with it, right? And then yet we have to be a part of it. Everybody has to play their role. It's so foreign to me because sometimes I see the inauthenticity and I'm like, I don't want to ever be driven by fame and likes and all these things that are soul crushing and make you empty and are endless. So I feel so blessed to have had a core stable value that I think a lot of us, whether it's social media or not, are just like driven by things that cause unhappiness.
Yeah, it's so interesting to me how the older we get, again, it's that clarity. It's like the older I get, I have two sons. They're 17 and 14. So one will be off to college next year. One's actually already living away, attending a soccer academy, and it's been an extreme challenge in our family. And I've talked about it a couple times on the
Wow.
podcast, because you then when you experience the love of your family and all the things that matter, and then things change, you are able to really prioritize the most important things. And sitting around the dinner table and having dinner last night as a family because it's Thanksgiving week and we're all together again, something that you so often take for granted becomes a pillar of the most important things, or the memories that they have that you don't have, but then your memories are different. And it's the little things so often that become so powerful. And so these ideologies and I love the belief comment. I want to just comment on that because I believe that sometimes that extra belief that someone just believes in you, that they, and it doesn't have to be mom and dad. Not all of us come from perfect scenarios. I'm also blessed to have a mom and a mom and a dad that are still married and they still love each other. And but just someone believing in you, the power of that, just having that. And I guess that's something you've experienced in your field, sitting across from someone who is addicted, who is challenged within a way. You're providing that belief that maybe they didn't get in the foundation of their life.
Yes, absolutely. And you know, we see this time and time again, like when they did an experiment with kids and they put kids like in the front row with in front of the teachers, or they told the teachers, you know, these are the smart kids. Like they did an experiment that just like they weren't any different than anyone else, but just the belief that somebody believed that they had potential. And even if it was because it was an experiment and the teacher was primed to think this way, when we expect more from people, we tell them, I think that you're capable of it. You know, like a lot of times I think kids might find that, you know, I'm a mom myself, they might find that as being pressure, but I try to tell my, and I also have two boys, and I try to tell them it's because I believe, you know, it's because we believe that you can rise to this and you have that within you. So I think it's sort of like that self-fulfilling prophecy. When you expect the best from someone, often you can get it because they are driven to achieve it, and not always. And I think that's really hard sometimes. I think if I were to talk about like sometimes seeing other people that you love or people that you really care about, like I think about my patients often as family. Like I treat them in the same way with the same level of care, concern, investment. And it is sad when you are not able to reach somebody because, you know, of all the things that they're contending with, you know, the disease aspect of it and any number of things. So that's also hard, you know.
Yeah. It's interesting to me in your field. I go to these huge genius network and these huge groups of entrepreneurs and successful CEOs and people that have done all these amazing things, written the best books and all whatever they all go to these rooms where they're like it's the island of misfit toys. We all feel like we're kind of this unique don't know where we fit in, but willing to make an impact in the world. And then you get in a room like that and you're surrounded by everybody that kind of feels and thinks the same way. What I notice so often is the room is often filled with people that had addictions, that were severely traumatized, that were challenged in major ways, and they overcame it. And they took that intensity that they had put in negative places and they positively applied it to places that were successful. And when I saw the practical optimism, it was something that I was thinking about is like just the mental shift from that this is the worst thing to this could be the greatest thing. I am built differently because I went through this. And now here's the future. I'm right where I'm supposed to be.
Yes. And I'm built differently. And like, you know, there's not only like, have I gone through stuff, but maybe I went through stuff because I'm built differently. You know, like a lot of the patients that I see, they didn't have the traditional, you know, capacities. Like, for example, school, it's like, you know, academic achievement, putting a round, you know, what a square peg in a round hole. They're like, that's not where I shined. And if that's the only metric that you're going to use to judge me, well, then, yeah, I'm not doing well because I don't have the capacity. Like I see a lot of kids, either they're like undiagnosed ADHD or dyslexia, and then they go into adulthood and they're like, I just thought of myself as never good at school, but I didn't realize I actually had something that was treatable or diagnosable that I could have, if I'd gotten treatment for it, which they didn't really do back then, things could have been different. But it's like sad because I think these same people, when they go out in the world, if they're driven, if they're hungry, if you're motivated, if you're persistent, and then you find the right calling that moves you, and then you feel like, oh my God, I found something that I'm so good at. And, you know, I love the concept of ikigai, the Japanese concept of, you know, vocation, purpose, mission, all of that. When it aligns, it's like this Venn diagram, this confluence of when all the stars align, I'm good at something, the world is willing to pay me for it. Like, how amazing is that? And I feel like some people aren't built for traditional 9 to 5. And that's why you have this room full of these amazing, talented people who And then also because they don't fit in, some of them might have, as a kid, they struggle because their parents are like, we don't know what to do with you. Either you're talking back, and maybe because they're smart and they're challenging authority. And it doesn't serve them when they're expected to be home and be obedient and follow the rules. And then when they're older and they're out on their own, they're just like, the world is my oyster. And, someone told me when I made that shift from working in a hospital to then going into practice, this mentor ahead of me, she was like, the beauty of having your own business is you can do anything you want, but that's also the downside. And so everything is up to you. You don't get up. Well, it's like you don't hunt, you don't kill. Well, you're not going to eat that day. So like that kind of mentality.
Yeah. It's interesting. When you talk about growing up, it's funny. I remember I've always been this entrepreneur, high energy, mentality individual. And my dad was uniquely different from me. And so, I was always looking at problems like they could be fixed. There was a solution to everything. If we were doing something that I thought it could be better, I was challenging that consistently. And as you get older, you're like, oh, maybe if you spend a little bit more time understanding the other human that you're challenging and understand what their levels are, what they are accomplishing, how their life is laid out. And you can see this again, this clarity as we get older. But as a young child, that energy going in the right direction really paid off. And then if it went in the wrong direction, it doesn't pay off. And so
Yes.
it's just such an interesting dynamic.
Totally. And the concept of like intrinsic motivation, it's great that like somebody's doing something because there's a reward, and maybe as a kid, like, you need to be motivated, maybe like in the subjects that you're not as interested in. But in the end of at the end of the day, I feel like, and I say this to my kids, like, I'm not going to be around forever. I hope I am to around for as much of your life as I, can be. But at the end, and when no one's looking, like that's what integrity is, for example, like how do you treat people? How do you act? How do you respond to the world when no one is watching? Like that's true honesty. And the same thing with motivation. So even if there's nothing to be gained, what inspires you? What would you do for free? And I talk about this in my book, like when I'm, helping people navigate career changes. And that's something that patients come to me all the time, or maybe they weren't coming for that reason. They came in for something else. And then I said, hey, by the way, let's look at every aspect of your life. How are you doing in this department? And then they're like, oh, speaking of career wise, I'm not so satisfied. And I've helped a lot of people make career transitions. And it's very interesting because I say you should get paid for your work. But just speaking hypothetically, what inspires you so much that you would do for free? So being motivated internally is so important because at some point, the parents are not in the picture, and you are going to go out in the world, and it really, depends on what's your hunger inside.
I tell a story in my book where I came home we do Sunday night dinners with our family, and I had made six figures for the first time. And I was in the financial services industry where everything's about money. Like, and when you're new, like you're hitting bogeys and these money goals, and it feels dirty the older you get. But in the beginning, you're just, oh my gosh, I might have done something really special. And nobody, my mom and dad hadn't done this. And I was sitting at the dinner table, probably in my early 20s, and I was getting ready to share it. And my dad made a comment that sounded something like, you have these people out there making six figures. And I remember it was a mental shift for me where I said, Scott, you're not working for your dad's approval, for your mom's approval, for your family's appreciation. You're working because you love to do it. You're excited to share because you love to do it. But this is not how we share. And this will never be what I talk about again. And I'm at the dinner table in this moment where I couldn't wait to share it. And I flipped the script, and it, I look back now and it was so remedial and so small in the big scheme of things, but it was so impactful in my life because there's this shift that we all go through where we're trying. I can only imagine what this felt like to you, and I'd love to hear this, but your dad is this amazing human who's changing people's lives. And you really are working in the beginning to show them that you can do this, that you are special, that they did a good job. And then it has to shift at some point in time to that they're not around. Who are we doing this for? And that kind of comes to your first pillar, which is purpose, right? It's that when you find that purpose, how does that drive you to be better?
Yes. And one thing I say about purpose is that it's not for anybody else's approval. And that's the big thing, is that so many people I know are living somebody else's purpose, and whether that might be like, when I say when you're living somebody else's purpose, I'm talking about not feeling as if you're authentic, in the sense that you're somehow doing living a life that is not aligned with what you really want, whether that's you've not married the right person. You like, we see this a lot in South Asian culture, right? Like arranged marriages, even in the United States, they're not as typical, like in the sense that you know the person, you've probably dated them for, maybe a few months before your parents are like, all right, like, you know, that expression SHIT, or get off the pot, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Like this is so the whole idea is that you're supposed to get married. But the point is, I know so many people who are now like getting divorced because they're like, I didn't want this life, I didn't want this person, I didn't want, I'm married to a woman instead of being married to a man, or whatever it might be. And I feel like that, being authentic and taking the time to say, who is this for? Is it for me? Is it for somebody else? And I feel like my parents never put any pressure. They were just like, and it's funny, I was the second child, and so and because I was a girl, and this is where it's funny, yes, progressive as my parents are, when my mom was, a third daughter in an Indian family in India, where they would cry. Her grandmother literally cried when she was born because it meant that they had to pay one more dowry. And her father raised her like a man who was like, you're going to get educated. She had a PhD. She had multiple masters, multiple bachelors. She finished high school at 13. As progressive as she was, I feel like in some ways they were like, yeah, yeah, you'll be fine. Their focus was on my older brother. They're like, we got to keep an eye on him. You'll be fine. You do the right thing. So they never really paid a lot of attention to me in some ways. And so I felt like I had to kind of entertain myself at a young age, amuse myself at a young age. And then I would just gravitated towards science and the humanities. And to me, psychiatry is the perfect blend of it. Like, I love black and white. I'm very logical and very rational, but I'm also super creative and believe in the art of medicine. And there's no other profession in medicine where you actually get to talk to people. And that is the healing in the talking. And, and a lot of people who are surgeons, they're in it, they fix it, and they're done. And I wanted to have long-standing relationships with people where I knew that, like, just like you said, giving them that attention and love and focus and these very high value conversations where I'm listening and I'm listening to every word they're saying, how they're saying it, reading in between the lines, the interpretation and of everything they've told me. And then putting in sort of my spin of, I'm hearing this, I want to reflect this back to you. What are the goals? And how is the life you're living matching up to those goals? So purpose is about just being very intentional, very deliberate, and also very authentic.
Yeah, and I've watched several of your reels, and I love that you mentioned how challenging sometimes and difficult it is, because we do these reels and we do all this stuff on social media, and we did grow up without it. So like, it's not a part of our lives, where my sons, like, they are so worried about what they post and how they post it, and they're not worried about the result, but they definitely think through the processes. And I'm like, if it's authentic, I'm putting it out there. If I mess up, it's okay. I'm imperfect. Like, this is who I am and what we do. But it really comes down to, when you're out there putting yourself out there and you're talking about purpose, purpose is not something, I've heard you say, that will just strike you. Sometimes you have to actually go out and find it, and talk to our listeners a little bit about that. Like, it's got to be something we work for, right?
Yes, yes. And I feel like, good for you, good for the person who knew from a young age, if they were like a musician, or an artist. Like, a lot of times people will say, I was good at it. And then also they had, luckily, a parent that had the time to invest. If I could think about an Olympic athlete or pro tennis player, like everything aligned where they were good at it, or their parent had a vision for them. And they also had, hundreds of hours and financial resources to put behind them, because it really takes a dedicated parent. And I want to hear about how your son ended up in the soccer academy. And I'm sure you and your wife must have had a big hand, I think. I don't know, you'll tell me. But we do have to go out and find it, because especially like a person might say, I feel like I'm not challenged. I hear this all the time. I'm bored at my job. I feel numb. I'm not growing. And there's a concept of role remake. So like, if you are working for someone and you want to continue working for them, is there any aspect of your job that can be changed or modified to bring you greater joy? Does that joy have to come from your daytime hours? Because it doesn't, right? Like, when you talked about impact, it could be from your day job, but that impact could also be in the evening hours or on the weekends. And whether it's a side hustle, and most people have one now, and then letting your side hustle grow and see where that takes you. Sometimes people feel like they need to quit the day job to do the side hustle. I mean, there's so many layers to that. I mean, you need financial support or whatever it might be, but don't give up. And I think that when we stop growing, right, is when we is when life is over. Like growth always has to be a part of your life, and that could come in the form of listening to podcasts, what inspires you. And you don't have to make money off the bat. You can say, I'm just going to do this for fun. And then let's see where this goes. And if there's traction, take courses, take classes, whatever it is that you're interested in, and I have patients who will, someone who works in, a big tech company, and then on the side, she's taking yoga, instructing classes and aromatherapy, all sorts of interesting things. And at the end, she realized, I did it. I'm glad I did it. But it's not what I want to pursue. And then, leaving this stable tech job is now, doing, entrepreneur with food industry. And so I just think that creativity has to be a part of it, and keep learning, keep searching, keep talking to people, going to seminars. But don't accept the status quo if you are feeling stagnant.
Yeah. So I think it's so important. I think a lot of young people today believe that they're going to be struck by lightning and they'll find their purpose. And or they try to live a purpose that they think the world will love, not what they love. And purpose and anything that we find impactful. We started the conversation before we even started recording about almost talking about what I like to call giving is selfish. Like, you are giving of yourself to a patient at 6:30 in the morning, and he needs to talk to you. It starts his day. It's almost like a personal trainer. You're telling the story. And the reality is you're telling it in a way that of how you're receiving something, growth, impact, purpose, opportunity. Like, it changes the way that you see the world. And I see that as so powerful. And I think that's something that so many people don't maybe understand yet.
Yes. Yes. And I'm so glad you brought that up, because I feel like one big part of purpose, I think that if you really want, if you ask me, and this may sound, biased, because there are people who are like, I love what I do and I don't necessarily give to anyone. At some point, that life is going to be empty. That in some form, your purpose could be, should be, to help other people. And there's so many studies on the benefits of volunteering and altruism. And one of the studies I talk about in the book is that there's a study of adolescents who were volunteering, and they were like helping younger kids with their homework, after school activities, and they ended up having less inflammation and therefore less cardiac disease later in life. And you might think like, wow, that seemed like so minuscule. And yet they find a Lancet study showed that people who have a purpose are 30% less likely to die or have heart attacks or have strokes over an 8.5-year period. And when that purpose is tied to giving back in some form, like, to me, there's no greater satisfaction in life. And like, if you can find a way where that happens to be how you make your living or not, it doesn't matter. There were so many days I remember growing up where my parents' living room would be filled with random people who were looked at my parents as leaders. And in the South Asian community, people would not seek help professionally. So they would come to my dad, and he would do so much pro bono work. And they would say, my son is having panic, attacks. Like, can you talk to him? And my dad would eventually say, listen, at some point you need to see a specialist. Like, and I'm going to give you the name of, these colleagues, and whether it's sliding scale, whether, and he also started a clinic. And both my parents, my mom had started a school in India in the 60s, which grew out of her living room to 1,000 students. And the two prime ministers got involved because it was a model school of integrating kids with disabilities into mainstream classrooms, which was unheard of back then. So they were always helping people and got nothing financially out of it. And both had done so much work, I would say equivalent to their full-time paid gigs, community work. And I look back, and, my husband jokes, he's like, I don't get it. Like, I look back and he's like, me and you were working, we have jobs, we help people, and at the same time, how did your parents have another 40 hours a week to do all of these side things that made them no money? He's like, I don't know, like, that's so impressive. And they were some of the, they were married, my mom, before she died, they were married 45 years, and they both supported each other. Both were badasses. And to see that love and to be like, that's what I want. That's what true partnership is, where I support. And that's unheard of in those days, like men sort of expected women to be subservient, and that, so it was the model of, you can be a great mother, you can find fulfillment professionally, and you can also give back. And her giving was so much more. And so, in some ways I do look back and I'm like, my first job was working with my mom at 11 in this school that she had started in the evening. So her day job was working for the Board of Ed, a New York Board of Ed, and then in the evening had started this Indian Cultural Institute. And that was my first job, is teaching kids who were like my age or just a few years younger Hindi, which I had learned in India because they dragged us to live in India for 2 years because they wanted to continue their mission work. And in those days I was like, where's the electricity? Where's the Saturday morning cartoons? There's no like American food here. I mean, now it's changed enormously, but I was always part of their purpose, and so part of it was, and I talk about the concept in my book, is this word dharma, which is about it's a Sanskrit word for duty, obligation. And I talk about how that conflicts with very much the like American Western approach. And I was born and raised in the United States. And it was, here we're like, go be you, be fabulous, independent. And in India or in that South Asian culture, it's interdependence. And I feel like that's what we're missing when we have this loneliness crisis and mental health crisis. It's because of this extreme idea, self-reliance, that we have to solve all of this by ourselves. And when we look at how the CDC talks about suicide rates have gone up 30% in 30 years, it's because they cite it and pin it to self-reliance, this hyper independence idea. And I talk about in the chapter on people. So there's 8 pillars, and people is one of them. And it's all about relationships, interpersonal relationships, relationship with yourself, something called like developing an intentional aloneness practice, which is enjoying your own company. But I talk a lot about the importance of interdependence and valuing our relationships, which is something I feel like is really missing. The quality of our relationships, especially amongst young people, is getting watered down.
Yeah, isn't it funny that the recipe for feeling loved is giving love?
Mm-hmm.
Really, the recipe is the opposite of what people often think. And I think in marriages, we always, it's something that you learn, because you do start out, if you have high value and you do know what you need, a lot of relationships start out where, you're both kind of saying, I need this and I need that. And you're both trying to meet each other's needs. But the best way as we grow up, and you just find this in what you were talking about with your mom and dad's 45-year successful marriage, is it was not easy for your father to have grown up the way he did and to change his logic, the way he believes, how he raised his children, how he celebrates his spouse maybe in a different way. There were moments of growth throughout his life, as there are in most relationships and most marriages. I am so glad that I'm not judged by who I was when we got married today, because that is not who I am. It's who I was. And each day we work on growing and getting better. And those people in our lives, if we're giving them love, and the hardest thing is to give without expectation. And believe me, in a marriage, it's not perfect and you won't do it all the time, but it is really so important. And so you're describing with people and connection something that derives from giving love to the community, giving love to your family, giving love to, someone that needs it, that doesn't have an opportunity. It changes our lives.
Yes. And, I think it's so important. Like, so many times it's hard for us to give because we lack an abundance mentality. We forget that we actually have a lot more to give. Like a lot of times people are like, I'm tapped out, I don't have anything to offer you. But they don't realize that in the 5 minutes, if a friend is trying to reach you and you were to take their call, and you might be avoiding it because you're like, oh, this person. I mean, I'm not saying allow yourself to be drained by people who don't respect your time and who, anything you say goes in one ear and goes out the other, or offering unsolicited advice. But I'm talking about someone who does respect your boundaries and maybe does need help, that you are equally benefiting in that way. So doing whatever you need to do to fill your tank so that in appropriate small doses, you can offer yourself. There's this idea in like yoga. I remember a yoga teacher once saying, like, lending your ego, not ego in a arrogant, egotistical way, but just offering of yourself. and that how yoga in that day, she was lending herself to us. And I thought that was such a beautiful way of saying that, if you don't have strength today, borrow from me. And think that we should all do the work so that we can become, our cups can be full. And that's what I say about practical optimism. And it's like I talk about it in the dedication page, is that it doesn't matter if your cup is you see the cup is half full or half empty, right? Because there's this idea that optimists tend to see the cup as more half full, and pessimists see it as half empty. Practical optimism teaches you that the glass is refillable and there's free refills. So take the time to fill your glass through these 8 pillars that start off with having a vision and a purpose. I talk about emotional processing, learning to process your emotions and emotional regulation. There's a tip in there. It's called name it, claim it, tame it, and reframe it. So when you're struggling, take the time to figure out what the trigger is. Take the time to figure out where that trigger is coming up in your body. Is it muscle tension? Is it headaches? A lot of people have stomach problems. Their body expresses what their mind cannot. So it's really important for us to get in touch with our emotions and find positive, healthy coping mechanisms, which we really need. And that's what optimism is about to me, is all of these things. And that's why it's practical, because we know that I learned, is that only 25% of optimism is genetic. 75% of it is learned. And that's where I'm like, you know what? Whether or not I'm a born optimist, I don't know. I don't know if I'll ever know that, but I do know that I will take the time to learn these skills, because I had to learn them the hard way myself, right? So it's not like I was just like, oh, I'm going to write a book about all this theory. No, I'm going to tell you that I was in the trenches in a variety of ways in my own life, being pulled in different directions, expectations, trying to be everything, and recognizing that I can't be everything to other people. I will be nothing to myself. So, a lot of what I'm writing is about stuff I've learned, the best practices, but also through my own trials and tribulations.
Yeah, it's so funny how the mind and the body are connected. I've always said I had some issues with gut and colitis and things like this that have showed up in my life through inflammation, and it comes at times where I feel out of control. So what I learned as I went through the progression of watching, it was never a major issue. It was always pretty small. And then I started a business 7 years ago, and apparently, like, my whole mentally, I felt fine. I was so good at reframing and renaming and actually taming that I was ignoring things that weren't true. So today, to fast forward to your point, I get up every day, I work out, I do the sauna, I have a cold plunge. That 3 to 5 minutes of chaos in my morning in that cold plunge allows me to settle. I pray in the sauna, in the cold plunge. I start my day, and I'm not perfect. I am far from it. I'm still imperfect in every way, but I'm a better dad. I'm a better husband. I'm a better friend. I'm better to my entire company. And than I was. And it helps to relieve that pressure valve that I didn't realize was so impactful. So when mine was, if I felt like I couldn't, if I felt like at the end of the day, I didn't have any time to myself. And so if you're a giver and you give without expectation, and you give and you give and you give, and you get to the end of the day and you feel like you've had nothing and you've not prioritized anything for yourself, that's when you're at your worst, because that's where you'll react, not respond. That's where you'll say the wrong thing. That's where you won't be kind. That's when, and I found in myself, by doing these simple things in the morning that could take anywhere, I could do it in as little as 10 to 15 minutes and as maximum as an hour and a half, but it changes my entire life. And so I believe, to your point, your last point, and you say so many great things, and I hope my brain remembers them all, but from scarcity to abundance, I felt like in the beginning of my life, the beginning of my career, I was laying on my back, punching up at the world, waiting for it to give me something better, and working hard and trying. And it was when I stood up and put my arms out and gave of myself that everything started to be better. And so you put
Mhm.
all those things together, and it's really all a little part of each of the things each of the points you made. But I'm so excited for this book because it's exactly the kinds of things that I feel personally I have battled with and gone through and overcame and continue to build on. This is a growth journey, not a
Mhm.
do it once and then hope it always
Yes,
gets better.
that's beautiful. You know, one thing also, like what I want to say that practical optimism isn't, is that it's not toxic positivity. It's not telling somebody that everything is going to work out without understanding the gravity sometimes of what a person has been through. And when I'm listening to you talk and having the wisdom of, 20 plus years behind you, and you're like, this is who I was back in the day, and this is who I am now. And I think especially hearing you as a father to two boys, and I'm fascinated by that. I want to hear, because what advice you have for me, Scott. I'm like, I'm talking, but you got to tell me, and then I'll finish my point. I want to hear from you. What wisdom have you gained in terms of like raising teenage boys and putting them on the right path?
So, here's what I'll say. I had to identify as they were growing up, I had to go through a mental shift where I realized that my imperfections were a part of fatherhood, that my intensity, when used in the right way, is a superpower. Turned up too loud is a challenge. So you have two kids. So the first thing I'll say is, like you mentioned with your older brother, my oldest son gets the rawest version of me. My youngest son gets a better version of me, and they both get a better version every day. So I have tried to keep them accountable, to focus on effort, not on the things that we couldn't control. I showed them how to be better, and I show them failure all the time. And I have a awesome, amazing spouse who together we are very, very aligned. And so you asked a question earlier about the youngest son who's at the academy. That's a perfect example of he is an intensity. My oldest and him are just as good of players. They are extremely great at sports when they play and when they put their mind to it. And with mom was athletic, dad's athletic. We talk sports. That's our language. Maybe like a family of doctors, that's kind of our thing, and we celebrate it. And if they're A, B students and they're not all straight A's, I celebrate what they're great at because I know that in life they'll find their path, right? And so my youngest is so intense though that his focus and his drive was to the point where I kept trying to give him just a little bit more of an opportunity. And it drove me and my wife together to do something that we're really uncomfortable with. And so, but we had to have the conversation where we reminded ourselves raising these children is not about us, it's about
Yes.
them. And every time we make it about us, we hold them back. Every time we
Mhm.
really look at who
Mhm.
they are, it gives them a better opportunity. So the shortened version of that is, he lives away. He lives with a wonderful family that we visit every single weekend. They take him to practices. He's accelerating and doing great. And if this becomes something that he gets to do professionally one day, wonderful. If it's something that he's using to learn to be a better human, even better, right? So, but his level of, I would say, positive obsession. I don't want to say the word addiction, but positive
Yeah.
obsession. Um, I was blessed enough to be able to move a lot of things around, to work
Mhm.
from away occasionally, to find the family that happens to be related to my wife who are amazing humans and helping us. And they have kids the same ages. And like everything just seems to work out because we keep moving towards opportunity. And then as we hit challenges,
Mhm.
we
Mhm.
pivot and we stay focused. And, you know, I don't know. I don't know if that helps. I don't have any secrets. I just do the best that I can. And when I fail, I admit it. And that is about
Mhm.
as simple as I can be as a father.
That's beautiful. Like everything that you said, but like moving towards opportunity and then being accountable as a parent, and I think that that was something that wasn't done when I was growing up. As parents never apologized to their kids. They never took responsibility. They didn't show their humanness. They weren't vulnerable. It was sort of like, this is how I do things. And I respect that on some level. I respect the way that I was parented in the sense that it offers structure and discipline. But I also recognize how authoritarian and sort of one-sided it was, and I tried to take the best that I got from the parenting because my dad is very involved. He's in his 80s. You would think he's like 15 years younger because he walks like 5 miles, strength trainings on the Peloton every morning, helps me pick up the kids from school. Like it's amazing. But it's very interesting to see his style of parenting, which feels so outdated now, and my kids and the way like they challenge all of us, and I love what you said about when we put ourselves and how we want to parent them, that's when things don't work out. So I'm very much like attuned to who are they, and there's this idea of our kids. The poet had said that, Kahlil Gibran, like they're not from us, they come through us. And that's a very interesting distinction because some people, some of my patients, when I look at their struggles with their parents, they will say, I felt like my parents thought of me as an extension of them. And, they were never able to see who I was. They just were like, this is what we want from you. You're making me look bad right now. I don't want you to do that. It was all about them. So, I think parenting is another evolution, like, because you get to think about your own. I mean, for me at least, I think about my own childhood and every strange, complicated conflict that I see myself when I'm trying to negotiate with my kids. You can't help but be like, what would I have done? How did I respond? I'd be like, oh my God, I was so afraid of my parents. I never would have said that to them. But I want to, it's this delicate balance between creating a healthy, safe space where I want them to feel like they can say anything. They're not going to be afraid, that I'm not going to judge them, but also sort of steer them in the right direction, and because ultimately, they're going to have to do this. There are going to be a million choices that they're going to have to make where I'm not in the picture. And it's not about me chastising them and consequences for me. Like their own life is their own consequence. So it's like, I want them to learn through trial and error and have that experience.
It's great. It's so interesting raising boys too, because, we are in a world where independent women are thriving, where the generations have changed. I had a conversation just a couple of weeks ago on a podcast where I said, I woke up and was the first generation where I was expected to do 50% of the work. And by the way, I never did 50%, even though I felt like I was doing 50%. I'm using air quotes for our listeners right now. But I was getting up and helping occasionally, excuse me, occasionally in the middle of the night. I was feeding our son. I took our son to the babysitters the first time. I mean, I talk about some of these things, and I remember it was a battle in my brain where I was like, I'm not even supposed to be doing these things. And then you would do them, and all of a sudden I was going to the kindergarten, parents' lunch. And my dad worked in the day. He couldn't do that. And my wife is a school teacher. She couldn't do it. So I was doing these things. I was there at Halloween every year. And, you get to a point where they're moving on and you're so grateful that you evolved and that you adjusted and you broke your own beliefs. And I continue to. There are lots of things that I will change. But I also think we have to take the things from to your point, your father being around and that generational disparity is so powerful, because I think it's great when our children get to see what, for boys, what a real man is. Somebody that protects their family, somebody that loves their family, that's there for them, that will support them, that, is also imperfect and maybe old school in thinking. And they get to start to challenge and be curious as to where that comes from. And I love that. That's such a great influence for your boys. I think that's beautiful.
Totally. I mean, I feel so lucky and blessed. Like, thank you. Thank you.
Please continue.
No,
I'm sorry.
I feel so lucky. I feel so lucky and blessed. Yes. No. I feel so lucky and blessed that, to have that influence. And, they say like when we talk about longevity, and the loneliness crisis, the pairing, let's say high school students with seniors is, they've done some experiments and both of them benefit. And those are actually the Gen Z and the greatest generation, or the two generations that are kind of suffering the most from the loneliness crisis. And I wish that there were more opportunities like in high schools, or, when they have the volunteering, that, pick a senior, like senior citizen, like a senior in high school picking a senior citizen. And there's so much wealth of knowledge and information and experience that, we don't get, because I feel like in our Western culture, as compared to Eastern would always say old is gold, and that older people were in the fold of family life. And, I remember one of my close mentors, but, she's very much of the, Western thinking of, she's older, and she was like, find your dad a good senior community. And at one point, my dad did find, we went to look at a place after my mom passed in Florida. And I was like, Dad, this place just looks a little dingy. Like it was like an Indian community in Orlando, and it was kind of dark, and there was no swimming pool. And I was like, Dad, no, this is not for you. Like, he's brilliant, super sharp, so accomplished. Self-made. And I was like, you need to be with us, and it's so interesting because he has tons of friends he keeps in touch with from medical school from literally 50, 60 years ago. And he takes me on trips. Like he was like, okay, we're going to Austria next year. We went on in 2019, took the whole family on a 1,000-mile road trip. We rented a car, my husband drove, and my dad was like, we're going to stop in Heidelberg to see this friend. We're going to Paris. Like he's, it's wild. We went to Vancouver Island for one of his friends. He went to Udaipur in Jaipur, where he went to med school with a reunion. And he's outliving all these people because he's so active mentally, socially, constantly giving back. So I feel like I have a chapter, the last chapter is practicing healthy habits. And I always say that optimists are what optimists do. And if there's one secret of optimism, optimists have better dental hygiene, they have better mental hygiene because they are taking care, they're going to their routine visits, they're doing the preventive stuff like what you talked about, Scott, waking up 10, 15 minutes to an hour, whatever time you have dedicating to self-care. And that's what I remember growing up in my family is that my parents would be doing early morning yoga, meditation, and I talk about the 4 M's in the book: mindfulness, movement, mastery, and meaningful engagement. And I had to say that, like, I didn't realize that I had a front row seat to practical optimism, growing up. I didn't know it. I didn't have a term for it, but I just saw the way that they lived their life and gave. And even now, my dad's like cutting fruit for me. Like, he's like, what do you need? And his mind is always about giving. And yet he's always laughing. He's got a glimmer in his eye, mischievous, always up to something. He's always planning some new trip. I was like, where are we going next, Dad? Like, we went to, I hadn't taken my husband and my kids to India. And so we went on a trip to India right before the pandemic, and we went to the Maldives from there. So that spirit of adventure, of travel, of always learning, my dad and I went to, in 2019, we both got an award from the American Psychiatric Association. I got a Distinguished Fellow Award, and he got a Distinguished 50-year Life Fellow Award. And it was so sweet for us to like walk down the aisle again and get it, these medals. And I just was so grateful that I had this early mentorship and that calling and desire. I don't know how I would have found psychiatry otherwise, because in those days it was like, you want to be a psychiatrist? What's wrong with you? Are you crazy? It was looked down upon. Now, I feel like in the last 20 years, there's more appreciation. And that's why I've been doing all the TV stuff, is because I want to get out there and I want people to have a face of psychiatry as a relatable, friendly, accessible voice, that it's not something you have to go to, so I get messages, from people from all over who are like, because of you, I got, so and so into help, or I've sought my own help. So I feel lucky to have had those influences. And now I feel, it was so weird. People like younger doctors are like, you're like a role model. I was like, oh my God, am I at that age already that I'm but it's sweet. It's sweet to be that person for younger generations. It's scary, but embrace it. I guess we have to embrace our aging.
I love it. It's funny, as a person who sees constantly in the future, I'm the visionary mindset, entrepreneur, visionary mindset. I actually sat in the cold plunge this morning and thought, I don't know that I've ever talked to my boys about what their mom and I hope we have as a family into the future. I don't want to put pressure on them, but I want them to know that we want to be involved. And I've never said it. Obviously we do Sunday night dinner with my family, but it's so impactful and important to me. And so many times as parents, I got to thinking about this, and I was like, I wonder would it apply pressure? Would it not apply pressure? Would I just be putting the seed out there so they understand that we want to be in their lives? And so it sounds to me like your father is making a very impactful impression that you're serving each other. Old is gold. And I think
Yes.
in a progressive place like the US, one of the challenges is sometimes our youth moves so fast that they forget the value and the gold of the old, meaning that if they're not curious as to why someone is talking the way they talk, or where their beliefs come from, or how antiquated something may be, but instead of being curious, they're judgmental, you can't see old as gold. You can only see it as washed away and outdated.
Yes.
And it's so sad. And I
Yes.
hope that changes. And I hope my kids see me as gold as well into the future.
That's beautiful. I hope so too. And I think they will. You're doing the right thing with that. That sounds great.
Well, one of the things that I like to do is I like to talk about different ways that people can find you. So as we wrap up now, the 8 pillars of optimism, of practical optimism, which is so key. You talk about the 4 M's of mental health. If people want more of this positive message, this new, exciting psychiatry and opportunity, and the things that you're putting out into the world to amplify your message, where do they find you? What do they do?
Thank you so much, Scott. So Practical Optimism, the art, science, and practice of exceptional well-being is coming out on February 20th, 2024, but it's available for pre-order now, anywhere books are sold. You can follow me on my website, drsuevarma.com. You can subscribe for blogs, behind the scenes of the media stuff, the fun morning shows, Good Morning America, Today Show. I'm on Instagram, across all of the platforms, Facebook, LinkedIn, and I would love to hear from people, and I would love for them to share the book. There's on my website, drsuevarma.com, there's a link for Porch Light Books, and they're doing bulk buys. So if this is something for corporate wellness, corporate gifting for the holidays, to me, this is the smallest investment that you'll ever make for an exceptional life, for thinking about your physical health, your family's health, your relational health, your spiritual health, your mental health. And to me, that's the best gift. So with Black Friday coming up and beyond, and the holidays, think of this, I think the minimum purchase is 25 copies. They'll be signed by me, and keep them. And you see somebody, I was very careful when I thought about the cover of the book, Scott. It's interesting because I wanted a book that would be inviting and that wouldn't be too serious, because that's kind of how I think of my approach, right? Like relatable, accessible, credible, but fun. And the lemon on the cover, I had a few different covers to choose from, and the lemon spoke to me because the lemon had a straw in it, and it was like, we're not just making lemonade, right? We're going to be clever, we're going to be quick about it. I've never seen a lemon with a straw in it. And then there's an umbrella, and I was like, because I was like, I put the umbrella, I'm like, we need it to be festive. We're not just making lemonade, which is great, I love lemonade, but we're going to make a party out of it. And that's what this book is about. It's like, I want you to, whatever your version of party is, I mean festive, I mean happy, I mean joyous. That's what I want for each and every one of you, to have a joyous, fun, exceptional life.
Well, when you put a book out, you put yourself out there. And it is extremely challenging for listeners that have done it, then you understand. For people that have not, it's in its own way a therapy. It is exciting, and it's also a lot of work. So thank you for putting your decades and decades of experience, your growth, your learning into a book and putting it out into the world. And we all hope that it is extremely successful. I hope all of our listeners buy it, maybe even buy it in bulk for the business people listening, so it can be something that can impact a lot more people. Practical optimism is something that hopefully everybody starts to say, Dr. Sue, and immediately practical optimism is what comes to their brain. So I have enjoyed this conversation. I really, really love the energy you bring to the table. I know that we talked about real things and real subjects and authentic feelings. And I think that's really, really special. I hope to not only meet you one day, but maybe your father, because he sounds like an
Yes.
amazing human. And I just wanted to thank you for being a part of the show today.
Thank you so much, Scott. I gained so much wisdom and knowledge in speaking to you as well. And like, I hope the best for you, the podcast, for your family, And, I love the idea of you talking to your boys about what that looks like, and maintaining that relationship and growing with them. So you're such a positive impact as a dad, as a business person, an entrepreneur. So thank you for having me on as part of this conversation.
It was truly a pleasure. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed this podcast. If you liked it, there's more where this one came from. Click here and enjoy some more.